I'd been married to Daniel for 3 years. He was everything I ever wanted in a partner: kind, loving, and extremely supportive. We were a close pair that everyone envied. We had not yet had children, but we were both looking forward to the day when we would. I believed our life together would be ideal, but one accident changed everything in ways I never anticipated. Daniel was not only friendly to me, he was kind to everyone. My parents loved him, and so did my pals. He had a knack of making others feel at ease, even if they didn't know him well. Claire, my sister, was likewise very career-oriented. She worked long hours, always seeking the next promotion, but despite her busy schedule, she and Daniel got along well. It was the type of sibling relationship you'd hope for. Everything changed when Daniel's profession began to need more of his time. He began working late into the evenings and on weekends, and it appeared that he was constantly on the phone, communicating with his colleagues. Initially, I didn't mind. I recognized how vital his job was. But as the weeks passed, something began to feel odd. His late hours and constant phone calls began to overwhelm him, and I could feel the distance between us widen. Looking back, I can understand why some people would have begun to suspect something was wrong, but I never doubted him. I was just concerned about his health. He wasn't sleeping well and had gotten increasingly angry, but I persuaded myself that it was just work-related stress. I had no reason to suppose it was more than that. Claire then chose to relocate to a new flat. She needed new furniture, so I decided to take her shopping with me. However, on Saturday morning, I received an unexpected call from my employer, requesting me to come into the office. I knew Claire had a busy schedule and that this was her only day off, so I didn't want to cancel. That's when I remembered Daniel had the day off. I asked if he might take Claire shopping instead, assuming it would allow them to spend time together. Initially, he hesitated. I could tell he wasn't delighted about it, but he eventually consented. "Okay, I will take her, but my car is in the shop. May I use yours?" I was very grateful for his assistance, even though I didn't think it would be the last time I felt glad for whatever he did. I was also nervous since this was the first time Daniel and Claire had ever gone out together, just the two of them. I was curious how they'd get along, if they'd find the correct furniture, and if we'd be able to eat together afterwards. It was already dark outside when I left the office. I picked up the phone to contact them, but before I could start dialing, I got an unexpected call from an unknown number. "Hello? Am I speaking with a family member of Daniel Knight?" The voice on the other end inquired. My heart sank. "Yes, this is his wife," I said, my voice shaking. "This is the police," the officer added. "Your husband has been in an accident. He has been brought to the hospital. Both he and his female passenger are unconscious. You have to come here as quickly as possible." I can't recall much after that. It's as if everything became numb. My hands shook as I grabbed my suitcase and ran out of the office. I recall the journey to the hospital seeming like a haze, with each second stretching out endlessly as I wondered what had happened, why it had happened, and if Daniel and Claire would be okay. When I arrived, I was immediately sent to the ICU. I stood outside the glass pane looking at Daniel's comatose corpse. He was wrapped in bandages, connected up to machines, and barely recognizable. I tried to keep myself steady, but I felt like I was drowning. My mother, who lived far away, was on her way and soon arrived, looking just as terrified as I was. We remained at the hospital, nervously awaiting any updates. Later, the cops arrived to speak with us. They told us everything they had gathered about the accident. According to their assessment, Daniel was traveling down a clear road when another automobile ran a red light and collided with him head-on. The second driver had been severely injured and was being treated at the same hospital. The police had interrogated the other driver, who said Daniel's automobile was moving abnormally prior to the collision. They suspected Daniel may have fallen asleep at the wheel. That was the first time I began to question whether everything was as it seemed. Daniel was always a cautious driver. He was not the sort to fall asleep behind the wheel, but I put that thought away. What mattered most was that he and Claire were both alive. A few days later, Daniel and Claire awoke. The physicians completed their testing and called us in to discuss the findings. I was holding my breath, hoping the harm was not too bad. However, when the doctor stated, my heart fell. "They'll survive," the doctor said. However, there is a considerable possibility that they will both suffer permanent disabilities. The damage is substantial, and while rehabilitation will help, it may not be sufficient to restore complete function. My mother and I were pleased they were still alive, but it did not feel like much of a win. We remained optimistic, focusing on assisting them in their recovery. I didn't want to inform them of the danger of permanent injury just yet. I didn't want to break their spirit. Instead, we supported them, telling them that they will improve over time. I took care of Daniel while my mother stayed with Claire. At first, Daniel was shocked. He continued apologizing and expressing his regret for causing everyone so much grief. I promised him that everything would be fine, but as time went, he began to alter. His dissatisfaction intensified, especially as his injuries became more visible. His leg had been severely wounded, and he was upset about the treatment, the hospital staff, and having to leave his job. He was no longer the gentle, loving man I'd married. His tolerance was growing thin, and each day seemed to be more difficult to get through. He started to push me away. He didn't want to see me, but when he did, he snapped at me. The furious, resentful guy he had become was not the person I knew. Despite this, I continued to visit him and do my best to encourage him. Then, one day, a police detective visited the hospital. He had new information on the disaster. The detective informed me that they had discovered something weird. Apparently, my car's brake oil had leaked. This explained the unusual way the car had been handled prior to the incident. Police assumed that the car's poor condition contributed to the crash. It also indicated that my car had been dangerous to drive. I felt a pit forming in my gut. If I had taken my car in for an inspection, this would not have occurred. Meanwhile, the woman who smashed into Daniel's car and ran the red light remained in critical condition. Her mother visited the hospital to apologize for what had transpired. It was my first meeting with her, and I could sense the pain in her eyes. She really apologized for her daughter's behavior, but it seemed too little, too late. Daniel's behavior began to deteriorate after that. He seems to resent me even more. He resented the fact that I could roam around while he was confined to a hospital bed. He despised the fact that I had to work to keep our finances solid, while he could only lie there. His rage became unbearable, and I found myself continually walking on eggshells around him. I didn't know what to anticipate from him each day. The days passed, and the emotional weight of everything began to wear me down. My life had become a daily juggling act. Working long hours, coordinating with the hospital, and handling the turmoil around Daniel and Claire's rehabilitation left me with little time to breathe. My responsibilities were piling up quicker than I could manage. I was always running on empty, yet I couldn't stop. I needed to keep going. Daniel's rage only intensified. He was no longer the gentle man I had married, the one who was concerned with the small things that made me happy. He was now irritated, bitter, and lashing out at me over minor issues. I could feel the distance between us growing by the day. He hated that I wasn't always there for him, that I had to leave him at the hospital to go to work, and every time I returned, it felt like he had greater expectations on me, as if nothing I did was adequate. I started dreading going to see him, but I continued pushing myself. It wasn't just for him, it was also for me. I hoped that if I continued to come up and be the person he needed, everything would return to normal. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't. He had changed, and so had I. Meanwhile, Claire was not faring much better. My mother, who had been doing her best to assist Daniel and Claire, was exhausted. Claire's condition was as terrible as Daniel's, and she was heavily reliant on my mother for assistance. Claire's demeanor, which had always been demanding, had gotten worse after the accident. Every time I called to check on my mother, she seemed more fatigued. I could sense the tension in her voice. It devastated my heart to learn that my mother, who had never complained, was now at her breaking point. Then one day, the news we had all been waiting for arrived. Daniel and Claire's circumstances were not improving. The specialists confirmed that the paralysis was permanent. No amount of rehabilitation or treatment would change it. They'd never walk again. It hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought I was prepared for it, but hearing it from the physicians was like a blow in the stomach. I held my breath while they spoke, my mind whirling with 1,000 ideas, but only one stuck: the truth of our new life. Everything we'd planned and dreamed for was suddenly out of reach. That's when the pressure really began to build. Claire faced me bluntly, as she often does. Her words sliced into me like a knife. "I heard your car was leaking oil," she stated, her tone chilly and accusatory. "You are in charge of preserving it, and now look at me. I can't work. My body will never return to normal. Mom is fatigued, and Daniel is in the same condition. You'll have to care for both of us for the rest of your life." Her comments struck me like a slap across the face. I stood there in disbelief, unable to respond. What can I say about that? How could I explain that I'd already done everything I could? My mother, too, carried her own burdens. But I lacked the energy to argue. I simply nodded and walked away, the weight of her words settling more into my chest. Later that day, I went to visit Daniel in the hospital. When I went into his room, I couldn't find him. I explored the halls and eventually located him seated in the common area with Claire. The two of them were conversing, their heads close together, and I stood there for a time, simply observing them. It was late, and the hospital was almost deserted. It felt awful to see them together, the two people I loved the most in the world. "Hey," I responded, walking over to them. Daniel looked up and glared. "You should have taken care of the car," he remarked. "If you had just gotten it inspected, none of this would have happened." I felt my fury rising, but I tried to remain calm. "I did get it inspected," I answered, my voice steady but forceful. "The automobile was good before the accident." "It was not my fault. You're responsible for this," he screamed. "You are responsible for everything. The insurance will pay for some of it, but you will have to care for us for the rest of our lives." "Got it?" Something inside of me cracked. The rage, fury, and crushing sense of betrayal that had been building up for weeks suddenly erupted. I'd done everything for him. Everything. And now he blamed me. "Since when did you and Claire become so close?" I inquired, my tone dripping with disdain. Daniel ignored my inquiry, but Claire did not. She did not even look at me. She simply nodded in accord with Daniel, as if what he said were gospel. I wasn't sure if I was more upset with them for their treachery or with myself for not noticing it sooner, but one thing was certain: I was not going to take it anymore. I refused to be their emotional punching bag, babysitter, or scapegoat. Something had to change, and I was tired of taking all the blame. There was a minute of silence before I spoke again. "I wonder if the woman who crashed into my car is doing any better," I remarked, my voice chilly. "How is she doing?" Claire gazed at me, her expression darkening. "How would I know? She ran a red light. Do you think I care about her?" "You should," I replied coldly. "She is the one who has done this to you, but perhaps she had assistance. Perhaps someone messed with my car's brakes." Daniel stared at me, puzzled. "What are you talking about?" "That's the thing," I explained. "I had a dash cam placed in my car, and it recorded everything." As I said, their faces had lost their color. The police had examined the clip. Daniel's affair with Claire was captured on camera. I had never suspected it, but now everything made sense. The minor incidents I had dismissed, the strange behavior I had chosen to ignore, they'd been together all along. Daniel's face became pallid. "Have you had an affair with my sister?" I inquired, my voice flat. I couldn't believe what was coming out of my mouth. Both of them hesitated, unsure how to answer. I wasn't waiting for a response. The truth was already revealed. The room fell silent as I stared at Daniel and Claire, my heart beating and my head reeling from what I had discovered. I had always implicitly trusted them, both of them, but now it was evident that the individuals on whom I had relied had deceived me in the worst way possible. They'd both played me for a fool. "I should have known," I said quietly, mostly to myself. My hands trembled as I held the hospital chair, attempting to maintain my composure. My voice remained firm, but my heart felt like it was breaking into pieces. Daniel opened his mouth, but no words emerged. He appeared to be trying to come up with an excuse, but nothing he said could ever undo the damage. Claire, on the other hand, did not even attempt to defend herself. She merely sat there, her attention fixed on the floor. I could see panic in her eyes. She knew the truth was out, and there was no more hiding. "Are you going to deny this?" I inquired, my tone cutting, anger and betrayal mingling with skepticism. There was an affair. The lies. Everything. Both of them stayed silent, but I didn't need to respond. I had the proof. The dashcam film captured everything. I had witnessed everything, the stolen moments, the hidden rendezvous, the way they stared at each other when they thought no one was watching. It had all been right in front of me, but I didn't want to believe it. I never thought I'd be the one to unearth this. I murmured slowly, my voice faltering as the weight of it all fell on me. But now that I know, you have to confront it. You can't hide anymore. I stared squarely at Daniel, who still hadn't spoken. His face was ashen, and I could feel the guilt seeping in. But it was too late to apologize. It's too late for excuses. I was willing to try, I added just above a whisper. While you were in the hospital, I considered not divorcing you. I considered giving you a chance if you apologized and told me the truth. Instead, you treated me as if I was at blame. You've made this much more difficult than it needed to be. Claire, who looked like she was about to burst, eventually spoke. I didn't mean for it to happen this way, she whispered softly, her voice shaking. I didn't realize things would get so bad. Bad? I repeated, my voice full of surprise. You never thought about how your actions will influence others? You never thought of me? Mom? You never considered how it would harm our family? Claire maintained silence, her face flushed with humiliation. But the harm had already been done. I could never undo what had transpired. You were never the person I thought you were, I said to her, my voice shaking, and neither was he. I looked at Daniel. I never expected to say this, but I'm done. I am done being your punching bag. I'm done being the person you blame for your mistakes. The air between us was thick with anxiety, but deep down I knew there was no turning back. Everything had altered in the space of a few minutes. My relationship with Claire, which served as the foundation for my marriage, had been entirely destroyed. I should have known from the beginning, I said, shaking my head. All the indications were there, but I ignored them. I kept thinking things would improve. That you would get back to me, Daniel. That we'd lead a happy life. But now I see the truth as it is. The room was suffocating, and for a moment I wondered whether I could even breathe. My heart ached, not only from the betrayal, but also from the realization that I was losing everything I knew and dreamed for. I believed I could solve it, that I could somehow hold everything together. But suddenly I realized that the life I had imagined with Daniel and Claire had vanished forever. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my voice firm despite the storm within me. I've already completed the paperwork. I am done. You are no longer my responsibility. The hush that ensued was deafening. Daniel's eyes flashed with rage, but he said nothing. Claire glanced at me with wide eyes, as if attempting to realize the gravity of the situation. I was not going to beg for their understanding, nor was I going to mourn over what had been lost. It was over. There was no turning back. I'm leaving, I announced, more to myself than anyone else. This is the end. With that, I turned and left the room. For the first time in weeks, I felt a wave of relief rush over me. The weight that had been crushing down on me for so long had now been lifted. I'd made the decision. I had regained control of my life. But the most difficult portion was still ahead. I had to tell my mom. I had to tell her that her daughter was involved in this betrayal, that her own daughter was the one who damaged everything. I wasn't sure how she'd react, but one thing was certain. I couldn't keep carrying this weight on my own. I didn't look back as I walked out of the hospital, the future unclear but within my control. As I approached the exit, the hospital hallway seemed to extend in front of me indefinitely. I couldn't hear anything above the pounding of my heart, and I couldn't think straight since my mind was clouded by emotions. Anger, hurt, perplexity, and a deep, gnawing sense of betrayal coalesced into a maelstrom within me. But I knew one thing for sure. I was done. The decision has been made. Daniel and Claire were no longer my problem. They had crossed an indelible line. I stepped out into the chilly night air, the weight of the world bearing down on me. The parking lot was practically empty, and my footsteps echoed as I headed to my car. I felt like a stranger in my own body, my head still whirling from what had happened. Not only had Daniel betrayed me, but so had Claire, my own sister. I had trusted her, and now I had to accept the fact that they were both involved in a plot that had damaged everything. I drove home in silence, the road ahead illuminated by the headlights, but all I saw was Daniel and Claire sitting together, gazing at each other as if they had been wronged. I couldn't get the image out of my thoughts. The reality was apparent, but a part of me still wanted to go back. I wanted to undo everything that had occurred, to pretend that this was all a horrible dream. But it wasn't. It was genuine, and there was no turning back. Everything felt different when I entered through our house's entrance, the familiar surroundings, the spots where we had shared so many memories. Now they all felt chilly and strange. It did not feel like home anymore. It hadn't happened in a while. My gaze naturally shifted to the living room, where I envisaged us getting old together. But that future vanished, smashed in an instant. I had to phone my mom. The thought caused my stomach to clench. I couldn't imagine how she'd respond. She had always regarded Daniel like a son, trusted and loved him. And now I was going to have to tell her that he was a liar and had destroyed our family. The worst part was that her own daughter, Claire, had been equally involved. The weight of reality was overwhelming, but I had no choice. I took a deep breath and called her phone. Her phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Hello, honey. How are you?" Her voice was smooth and warm, as it had always been. It simply made the next words more difficult to speak. "Mom, I need to talk to you," I murmured, my voice shaking. "It's about Daniel and Claire." I could hear the change in her tone, the fear creeping in. "What happened? Are they all right?" "They're alive," I replied, but even as I spoke, the words stung. "But they have been lying to me. Almost anything." There was a pause at the other end of the line. I could feel my mother's confusion and distress, but there was something I couldn't hide from her. "What are you saying, honey?" I took a deep breath and fought the lump in my throat. "Mom, Daniel, and Claire have been having an affair. And what about the accident? It wasn't just an accident. Claire tampered with the car's brake oil, which is what caused it. They wanted me gone, so they used the accident to try to harm me, but it backfired. They're the ones who got injured, not me." The hush that ensued was deafening. I waited for my mother to speak, but she seemed paralyzed. "Mom?" Finally, her voice broke through, but it was barely audible. No, this cannot be real." "I'm sorry, Mom," I replied as my voice broke. "I wish it was not true, but it is. I'm not sure how to repair this, but I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it isn't. My mother paused, her voice shaky. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything, Mom," I assured her. "I just wanted to let you know. I'm divorcing Daniel and terminating relations with Claire." The conversation stopped soon after that. My mother was stunned, and I didn't have the strength to continue. I needed time. I needed to process everything that had happened and what I had learnt, but I did not have the luxury of time. I had to continue moving forward. The following few days were a blur. I packed away the last of Daniel's belongings, cleaned out the area where we used to reside, and began the process of moving on. But no matter how many things I took out of the house, I couldn't bring the memories with me. They were stuck in my head, haunting me. And then there was Claire. I had to figure out how to deal with her and the fact that she had participated in this treachery. I couldn't trust her anymore, which hurt more than anything. Even so, I couldn't simply abandon her. She was my sister, and despite everything, I still wanted to help her. But I knew I needed to put myself first. I contacted my lawyer to begin the divorce procedure. I'd previously completed the paperwork, but now it was time to make it official. I was prepared to leave that life behind. I needed to be, for my own sanity. It felt like I was going through a fog, each step laden with the weight of all that had occurred. The world around me felt quieter now, as if it had taken a big breath and was keeping it in until I made the next move, and I moved forward, one step at a time. Despite the tension in my bones from each new decision I had to make, there was no turning back now. The first thing I had to do was clean up the mess with my sister. Claire. My heart wrenched just thinking of her name. How could someone who was meant to be my closest buddy, with whom I shared so many memories, betray me like this? I reflected on the hours we spent together growing up, the secrets we shared, the laughter and tears. How could she turn on me? But she did. And by doing so, she cemented her own fate in my life. I did not want to be furious anymore. I realized I needed to focus on my own healing right now. I couldn't afford to be locked in the past, clinging to the sister I once knew. She wasn't the same person anymore. She was not someone I could depend on. I needed to let go, but this didn't mean I could abandon her entirely. I knew she was hurting and dealing with the consequences of her own conduct. There was nothing I could do to compensate for the pain she had caused, but I couldn't sit back and do nothing either. So I set up a care facility for her, one that could satisfy her needs and provide the professional assistance she required. It was the most difficult thing I had ever had to do. Knowing that my once adored sister would now be in the hands of strangers made my stomach twist with shame and grief. But there were no other options. My mother couldn't handle it, and I was starting to realize that neither could I. The next day, I sat down with my mother. I expected her to be upset, but I didn't anticipate the deep sadness in her eyes when we talked about Claire. "I never thought it would come to this," she said quietly, shaking her head. "She's my daughter, but I can't do it anymore, not after everything that's happened." It hurt to watch my mother so broken. I wanted to shield her from everything, but I couldn't. All I could do was be present for her. In that moment, I understood I had finally taken charge of my own life. For the first time, I was not the one being cared for. I was not the one attempting to fix everything. I was putting myself first. Divorce papers were filed. It was official now. Daniel and I were no longer together. It felt unusual, like walking out of a cloud and seeing everything clearly for the first time. For years, I had tried to keep our marriage together, even while it slid through my fingers. There was nothing left but the paperwork. I felt a profound sense of relief, but there was also an undercurrent of grief. The life I had anticipated with him, the future we had previously envisioned, had vanished. Nonetheless, I couldn't bring myself to mourn it. Not while I was still grieving from the betrayal, not when I knew I had the opportunity to make something better for myself. Life went on, as it always does. Days moved into weeks, and I concentrated on getting my life back together. I put myself into my career, which I hadn't done in years. The promotion I had always wanted seemed so out of reach previously, but now I was determined to make it happen. I enrolled in an online business school, which was something I never considered before. I had no idea how much I had missed this side of myself, the ambitious, determined woman who could do so much more than be someone's wife or sister. As I worked hard to secure my future, something unexpected happened. Men began to notice me differently. It seemed bizarre at first, like if I had suddenly gone invisible in a crowd, but now I was the one being sought after. But I didn't want any of it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to start another relationship. Daniel's betrayal remained in my mind, and I needed time to heal. I wasn't going to rush into something new because I was lonely or because others thought I was attractive. I wasn't that woman anymore. Instead, I focused on myself. I concentrated on maturing, on learning who I was outside of my marriage and family. It was not easy. There were days when I felt like I was going through the motions, and days when I wished I could live the life I had imagined. But as time passed, I started to perceive myself differently. I was stronger than I had believed imaginable. I was learning new things and pushed myself beyond what I thought I could accomplish. and, little by little, I began to feel like the woman I had always wanted to be. A year later, I was at the start of a new chapter. I had received my business certification and had begun to advance in my career. More importantly, I had rediscovered my self-worth. I did not need Daniel, Claire, or anybody else to define me. I had learnt to stand on my own 2 feet, and for the first time in years, I felt liberated. Around that time, I met someone new, someone who saw me for who I was rather than what I could contribute or how I might help others. Tom was the teacher that took me through the online business school. He had been a mentor, but over time something deeper had grown between us. He was caring, attentive, and understanding. He made me feel safer again. He convinced me that love could be something good again, not something that would rip me apart. Tom did not strive to fix or save me. He had respect for me, and it made all the difference. For the first time, I was not terrified of the future. It felt like a second chance, not just in love, but also in life, and I was prepared to take it. The life I previously knew, which I had held to for so long, seemed like a distant memory now. The last few years have been a whirlwind, leaving me scarred but stronger. I had emerged from the hurricane, not unhurt, but transformed. In a way, that transformation had been the key to my liberation. Tom and I grew closer, and he taught me how to let go of the past. He wasn't perfect, but he was ideal for me, dependable, supportive, and truly nice. It wasn't about repairing what was damaged, but about creating something entirely new. He taught me that love did not have to be a cage, it could be a collaboration, a safe haven where I did not have to lose myself. Meanwhile, Daniel and Claire's lives began to disintegrate. Daniel, now with his parents, was obsessed by shame and fury, falling into an unstable state. His family, once proud of him, now viewed him as a burden. I could hear whispers about him among our old circle of friends. They blamed him for everything: his affair, his decisions, and his treatment of me. I did not feel sorry for him. He'd made his bed. Claire stayed in the care facility, her life forever transformed by the accident she had caused. My mother paid her regular visits, but I couldn't take on that responsibility anymore. Claire had made her decisions, and now she needed to live with them. I, on the other hand, was creating a new life piece by piece. I concentrated on my profession, on personal development, and on finding delight in modest, quiet moments. And in the evenings, I returned home to Tom, the man who made me feel like I was enough exactly as I was. He was not attempting to fix me. He simply wanted to be with me. 2 years after the divorce, I looked back and felt grateful. I'd endured the treachery, heartache, and loss, and I emerged stronger, wiser, and more peaceful. I had rebuilt my life around the woman I had become rather than the people who had damaged me. Sometimes life provides you second chances when you least expect them. I had no idea where my future would lead me, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out.